And this is one of those chapters that's going to stick in the back of my mind for the entirety of the series. Because what happens in this chapter is going to be what drives the development for both Yuka and Cross as characters from this moment forward, and be the deciding factor on whose side Cross takes in the inevitable war between Japan and the Somorians. Which this chapter pretty much all but guarantees is on the horizon, and I think we now have a timeline on when that's going to happen. As of the ending of chapter 7, we have less than 6 months to stop this war before it even begins. But before any of that, we finally get to put to bed this storyline revolving around the old man who's been pretending to be a kid, after he managed to sneak away from everyone, somehow surviving that brutal onslaught from Maro in the last chapter. Not sure exactly how that happened. I guess he's a little bit more adorable than he looks. Unfortunately for him though, he managed to sneak away from everyone else, only to be caught by Usami, who we end up finding out in this chapter is a cursed speech user. And I gotta say, his way of using that technique is so much more efficient than Inumaki's was. Because as you know, if you read the original series, Inumaki had the seal on his mouth, which meant he was very limited in the words he could say, hence why he spoke only by saying the names of food, like sushi or takoyami, because actual words would trigger his technique and could cause damage to people if he wasn't careful. But Usami, doing his best Roy Mustang impression, instead has the seal etched into a glove and activates it by holding the snake design over his mouth as he speaks. And I just know Inumaki, if he is dead by this point, it's just looking down at Usami using the same technique that he had, and cursing just how much more convenient his way of doing it is. Although, to be fair to Inumaki, I don't remember if in the original series they mentioned whether or not he was born with the seal around his mouth, or if it was something that he added on later on in life. And if it was the former, then he just kind of got a bad lot. But now that the old man had a final bit of his HP chipped away by the combo Usami used on him, he has been captured, and that puts an end to his story. For now, at least. Because I have a strong feeling that just like with the kidnapper from the first 2 chapters, we haven't seen the last of this guy just yet. The amount of knowledge that Gege showed that he had on the Jujutsu world is way too vast for him to just be a one-off character. So even if it ends up being just to answer a question or two about their world that Usami and the higher-ups won't, I think he'll show up at least one more time when our protagonists need some more outside help. Especially if we need to track down Yuji, which, based on a certain scene in this chapter, we might need to in the very near future. But that's a conversation for later. A more urgent one is a small little spat we get between a very angry Cross and a barely conscious Tsurugi, the former upset with the latter using the term neighbor when trying to calm down Maro in the last chapter. Which, based on how angry he's getting here in the scene, that word must have a much deeper meaning in the Somorian language than simply just kind of translating to friends like the way Maro implied it did in the previous chapter. Because Cross is very visibly upset with the idea, saying that humans and Somorians would never be neighbors. Emphasis on the use of would never instead of could never. Because it becomes clear as day during this little rant that Cross goes on that he has a very strong resentment towards humans, their way of life, and how easy they seem to be able to live. While the Somorians had to struggle and fight to survive on a daily basis, being forced to live as refugees on this unfamiliar world. And while we can't say for certain, because as of this chapter, we've only met a total of 4 of them, one of which we haven't seen actually interact with humans yet, it does seem like we're setting up a scenario where the consensus is already set amongst the alien race that humans are bad, and in order to make the Earth our new home, we have to take the planet from them. Or at the very least, the ones in charge are thinking that way. The other 49,996 on the colony ship are likely more split on what to think of humans, having not interacted with them up to this point, and are likely being fed propaganda about them to stoke fear and resentment in order to make it easier to convince them that war is their only solution. You know, something along the lines of what Cross says in the chapter to both Tsurugi and Yuka, leaving Maro as the lone voice of positivity in a sea of negative emotions towards the human race as the only one who seems to think that they can both not only coexist, but become friends. Or, you know, in this case, neighbors as he would call it, which again, his brother Cross was not happy he let slip to the humans. And I think trying to get an insight into why Maro would trust these humans he barely knows was something that seems so personal to their people, as well as why he is so sure they can live together peacefully, is why Cross decides to impersonate him in this chapter. Though he doesn't do a great job at it. Admittedly, it's pretty hard to tell the difference at first when he meets Tsurugi at the hospital, but it takes like less than 5 seconds for cracks to start forming in his act. It's just a little mannerisms at first, that leaning in while asking about Cross while something Maro might do just seemed off for some reason. Not to mention his reaction when Tsurugi started to talk about him negatively. And then there's his attitude during their trip to the amusement park. That was probably the most obvious tell. The real Maro would have been as excited as a 7-year-old going there for the first time. And what he said to the lost kid when trying to get him to stop crying was so out of character that he might as well have just put on a sign saying, "I'm not Maro." But admittedly, there were times when he acted in a way that you would expect from Maro, like when he was trying to cheer up said lost kid by doing that flip to entertain him. That was something I think Maro would have done. As well as his reaction towards Haruki's apology in the hospital, being genuinely caught off guard by the human trying to be sincere. And the key thing to notice during this part of the chapter is that Cross acts the most like Maro during times when he's not trying to act, but we get his genuine in-the-moment reaction towards humans. Leading me to think that deep down, like Maro, he doesn't want this war to break out either, but he's so consumed by grief and anger over what happened to his people that he can't help but blame everyone else for their lot in life. And this is exactly what makes the second half of this chapter so memorable, because we pair across someone whose heart has been consumed by hatred and negativity due to what was taken from him, with someone who arguably has been given an even worse fate, and yet is still filled with positivity. Because we find out the next day after their outing to the amusement park that Yuka is dying. The doctor who checked her over after the mission found a mass in her brain, and the second doctor her and Cross went to confirmed it. She only has 6 months left to live. And Cross's reaction to the news is meant to represent how a person this young might normally take this fatal diagnosis, where he says that even though she still has some time left, her heart died the moment she got the news. And from now on, not even the small things in life that brought her joy would be able to move it again. Which, I mean, yeah, she's only 16. Hearing that her life is being cut short this early would normally devastate someone. Hell, I'm in my early 30s and I can't imagine reacting in any way that doesn't seem negative to this kind of thing. But Yuka, while a little bummed out, doesn't seem to be that put off by the news. Her reaction is more like, "Man, that kinda sucks," rather than doom and gloom. And I think it's due to her life growing up as a sorcerer, where every mission she went on meant risking her life, so she likely was already prepared to die at any time. That's why this isn't hitting her as hard as you'd think it would. I mean, sure, once news gets to her brother and Maro, they'll likely have a very dramatic reaction. I can even see this leading to Tsurugi doing something very dangerous in an attempt to save his sister, which is a discussion for a different video. But Yuka has accepted her fate and plans to face it as herself instead of what grief would turn her into. Which is why she was the perfect one to pair with Crosshair and begin to plant the seeds of hope in his darkened heart. Because unlike Tsurugi, she can see things from the very same viewpoint, but have a completely different outlook. Frost's main gripe is that everything was stolen from him. His people were seemingly forced from their home by some yet-to-be-named third party, with assumedly many of their loved ones killed in the process, and now are stuck living the lives of refugees on this unfamiliar world. Where, even if they did choose a path of peace, they'd never truly be free due to having to check their behavior and culture in order to conform with Japan's societal rules. And that's if they are even allowed to live normal lives here. It's just as likely that they get treated as second-class citizens the moment they leave their ship. Think of the people of Ymir that lived on Marley in Attack on Titan, where they're relegated to sections of the continent, not given equal standards of living, and only those who prove their worth are given even semi-decent lives. And that's a very possible future that Samarians face, and the one that Cross fears is the most likely if the two species try to coexist. It took 7 chapters for me to really get it, but that's the overall theme of the sequel, a story about immigration and the struggles both sides of that coin face when dealing with this life-changing circumstance. But all the arguments that Cross throws at Yuka against peace isn't able to overcome her one. They'll keep on living. Even if it takes years or decades, they can change their lot in life, make it so that Earth becomes a true home to them, just like their planet was, and come to see humans as true neighbors. While no matter what she does from this moment forward, it won't change the fact that Yuka will be dead in half a year. And it's only if they continue this path of hatred that more of their people will face the same fate. Which is why, as the chapter ends, she extends her hand across in an attempt to end this cycle and begin a new one. And this is why in the beginning of this video, I said that this chapter would be what drives these two characters going forward, because while at first he may reject her words, Cross's journey in the story will be him accepting that she's ultimately right, and eventually join the side that wants peace, while Yuka's will be to help secure that future with what little time she has left. And since Gege announced at the start of the sequel that it would only last for about 6 months in real-world time, the same amount of time Yuka was given, it's likely that this story will tragically end with her death. That is to say, unless her brother is able to change her fate by making a deal with the devil.